Okay, then I think we're live now on YouTube. I'd like to welcome everybody to this event called Israel and the New Middle East by the Mid-East Freedom Forum Berlin. My name, I think we're live now on YouTube. I'd like to welcome everybody to this event called Israel. So I got a few technical problems, but I think now everything is okay and you don't have a double speaker on your ears. So my name is Michael Spaney. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-East Freedom Forum Berlin. I'd like to welcome you, everybody on YouTube here. And I'd like to welcome our dear guest, Mr. Seth Frantzman from Israel. Hello, Mr. Frantzman.
Hello.
I'd like to introduce our organization a little bit for those who don't know us. We are a political consultancy organization, and it is an institute also for political education in universities and other adult education organizations. So we are talking with the parliament, with some ministries, and also we have an educational programs around the country in Germany going on. And now I want to come to our guest. I want to introduce Seth Frantzman a little bit to you and the issue of our talk today. Seth Frantzman is a Middle East expert and a political analyst. He's based in Jerusalem, but he is also a frequent visitor to almost all countries in the region, let's say Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, and of course the United Arab Emirates. He just said to me that he was on the flights, direct flights from Israel to Dubai, which were newly introduced after the accords last year. Mr. Seth Frantzman is the director of MICRA, the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis. He's the author of various books and articles. His recent book is called After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. And he has just said to me that a new book is coming out called Drone Wars, and it'll come out in June, I guess. Mrs. Frantzman received his PhD from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he was also a lecturer at the Palestinian Al-Quds University in East Jerusalem. He has published articles in Jerusalem Post, Newsweek, The Hill, National Interest, and many other media. And he is also a frequent guest in interviews on CNN, BBC Radio, and others. And which is very important for us today. He's the founder of a website called israelgulfreport.com, israelgulfreport.com, which deals with articles and on the subject of our talk today. So this is our guest, Seth Frantzman, and the issue is Israel and the Middle East, the title of our event today, but it's also a new program for the Mid-East Freedom Forum Berlin. So you will see a lot of events coming up in the following month when the program will continue. But today we'll start with Mr. Frantzman. Changes going on in the Middle East. We're going to speak today about the new alliances in the Middle East since the conclusions of the so-called Abraham Accords in summer and autumn 2020. It's about new security perspectives, but also about economic opportunities for Israel and the region after signing the treaties with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and the resumption of diplomatic ties with Morocco. We will shed today some light on social experts, on the answers to the questions, what the Abraham Accords differ to the peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt, And today is mainly about the innovative and pioneering power of these alliances, of these new alliances for the entire region, Middle East, North Africa, which offer, as we think, an historic opportunity and will advance the Israeli-Arab relations and cooperations, and even can advance friendships between Arab and countries and Israel. And with that, I'm going to close and I give over the word to Mr. Seth Frantzman. Please, it's your turn.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I know you've prepared some questions. I do think we're living in a very important, era that is perhaps a kind of game changer for the region. I think that if we look back at the last, let's say, decades, we had the Oslo Peace Accords in the 90s, and then that kind of didn't turn into the peace that everyone thought it would be. And I think it's important to look at that as part of a broad trend in history in the world, which is that the 90s was the era after the Cold War. There was the Gulf War, as people recall, 91, and the United States was a global hegemon. And many people thought that parts of the world, the old conflicts that had taken place as part of the Cold War, the end of colonialism, those conflicts would kind of end, and there would be this American hegemony, and there'd be democracy everywhere. And what we saw was that very rapidly, there was a kind of retrenchment, and there was all of a sudden global Islamist terrorism that led to 9/11. There were all sorts of conflicts that broke out in the aftermath of the Cold War, like what happened with Azerbaijan and Armenia or other places. And what we've seen then, of course, is in the last 2 decades, a rise of many authoritarian states and a lot of challenges to this U.S. World power, and also the U.S. taking a step back from that. And I think what we see, therefore, in terms of what's happening with Israel, which is very fascinating, is that the region that was kind of obsessively focused on the Israel-Palestinian issue has shifted a lot. And I think that while the Palestinian issue with the Israelis, or the conflict, however you want to call it, is certainly by no means solved, it is a kind of frozen conflict. Palestinians have an autonomous region. And now what we've seen is that the Arab countries that were Israel's, let's say, historic adversaries, because it was called the Israel-Arab conflict, almost all of them now have made some peace with Israel, or at least have accepted that Israel is there and there's not going to be, this great invasion that will destroy the country. So we have this new, I think, alignment in terms of Israel and the Gulf states and Egypt and Jordan, and these alignment may be shared interests, or it looks like also to be an alignment that includes a lot of economic opportunities. Just today, Etihad Airlines flew the first flight from Abu Dhabi. Last year, Fly Dubai began operating flights from Dubai, and there was something like 100,000 Israelis who went there within like a few weeks. I don't think so many Israelis have ever gone one place since the time of Moses. I mean, it was wild. So, it's a real warm relationship. It doesn't mean that, of course, we've seen in the past that people have high hopes for peace. Things can go wrong, but these countries have a lot in common economically. They are regional hubs in high tech that spans a kind of arc. If you think an arc of stability and economic power that goes from Europe through Greece, through the Eastern Mediterranean to Israel, the Gulf, and places to Asia, India, Singapore, South Korea, even China, wherever you like, Australia. So we have an interesting opportunity now to reset or change the economic flow in the Middle East and the global region, to encourage stability after a decade of fights against ISIS and Iranian destabilization, and to hopefully create a kind of force of moderates, because it is true that the Gulf states have sought to become much more moderate, and they are really talking about coexistence. There is, I think, tomorrow, a Holocaust, a memorial event that will happen in Dubai, which is this is an unprecedented, I think, level of support in the UAE, especially for Jewish holidays and Jewish culture, and something that for many years in the Middle East, to be honest, I mean, as someone who is Jewish and travels in the region, it was often difficult to tell people, I'm Jewish, or certainly you could not wear a Star of David or something. So not everywhere in the region, but it was generally the case. So, and we took that for granted. So.
Okay, now you painted the big picture. I think every point you mentioned, we have to look a little bit through. So let's start with the question: can you explain a little bit the developments that led to the new normalization treaties with Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain? What wide range of opportunities do these Abraham Accords, these new treaties, provide, and for whom? Mainly it's the question about why did you found this new website, Israel Gulf Report? You certainly might find it so important that you have done this.
Well, when the treaty kind of came into being, and it happened very quickly, if you recall, I think it was June, July. There were rumors of there would be some visit or some sort of discussions between Israel and the UAE, and everyone had looked at the UAE, I think, as a potential partner for Israel. But I don't think anyone imagined all of a sudden they will announce normalization and trade and flights, because the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan had been so cold, I think, that it was not imagined that it would happen all of a sudden. And all of a sudden it did happen rapidly. July, August, there was the announcement. September, the deal with Bahrain also. And then, of course, Sudan coming on board. And then there was amazing, Hanukkah already, there were the flights. So, in fact, the flights came so quickly that the ability to put a visa regime in place, which is a bureaucratic issue, which takes months, actually, they could not even do it fast enough. So Israelis were going, and they had to retroactively do all this visa work and payments and stuff. I was, enthusiastic about it, and all of a sudden, something that usually, as a journalist in the region, we would write about, according to foreign sources, it was very difficult to write anything officially about Israel Gulf relations because it was all very quiet and clandestine and based on rumors and secret meetings and things. So I think all of a sudden, we could really write about it. And then I said to myself, well, it's great that we can write about it, but there's so much going on. It's hard to keep track of all of it. So I decided, let's create a website and a platform on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and a website that devoted just to the Israel Gulf, report, which is what it's called. And then in terms of it, we'll cover kind of a digest of information about the events that are happening, and the Twitter account will just be kind of a news aggregator, retweeting anything that's related to this, and that will give any journalist or anyone a place to kind of call home if they want to learn about what's happening or learn about the updates and the changes. So I created the website, and I think you asked about the developments of how we got here. I think that, look, Israel was never at war with the Gulf, so it's not that they call it peace treaties. It's great, but at the end of the day, the Gulf was obviously not an area that was really against Israel. It should be recalled. The Saudi Arabia, which was, of course, hostile to Israel in the past, by the period of 2000, 2001, 2002, the Saudis had put forward the Saudi Initiative, which was part of the Arab League Initiative, which basically promised peace in return for Israel's withdrawal to the 67 lines. So the Saudis had already basically said, look, we're willing to normalize, and we will lead the Islamic world in normalization, but the Israelis have to do something to get there. So I think everyone understood, look, there's a recipe here for the Saudis and also all of their friends to come on board. The question is that, of course, Israel was not going to withdraw. And so it was clear that during the Bush and then Obama administrations, we have this famous story of John Kerry giving a speech where he's asked, well, what about Israel and the Gulf? Will they have peace? And John Kerry says, no. The Gulf will never normalize with Israel unless Israel has an agreement with the Palestinians. This gave the Palestinians tremendous leverage because the Palestinians could say to Israel, we Palestinians may look weak, but we are the key to the whole region. If you're not nice to us and give us everything, no one will normalize. And it's crazy. Normalization is the basis of international relations. It's so interesting that, unfortunately, for Israel being isolated for so long, there was this idea that somehow just having relations like ambassadorships would somehow be strange with these Muslim countries. And it's funny when you think of the way the West, and John Kerry, for instance, talked about Iran. We need to engage with Iran. Well, what about Israel and the Gulf? No, there should be no normalization. Well, they should be engaging too. And I think the Gulf understood that eventually, which is that as the Obama administration and Trump administration signaled that the US would be withdrawing a bit from the region, the Arab countries understood, especially Saudi Arabia, they face a lot of other serious challenges in the region, which are Iran or even hostility in Turkey or other places. And they don't have time to be dealing with the Israeli issue as much. And they think they could probably get more done with Israel as a peace partner than as a hostile partner, because what did they achieve for 70 years? Not much. And I think that there was an understanding that Israel and the Arab countries share a lot in common, not just economically, but in terms of world vision in the region, whether it's Iran or Islamist extremism. So these countries were able to come on board. The Saudis gave the green light. And it's important to know the Saudis didn't make peace yet, because I think they need Israel to do something as well. It's very important for the Gulf countries to be able to say that they made peace because they got Israel to do something. That means that they're shown as doing something for the Islamic Arab cause as well. Every side does something. So what did Israel do? According to the UAE, Israel said it wouldn't annex the West Bank. So they could say, look, we got Israel to do this, now we're going to do this. And I think that it's very important to understand that there are transactional relationships. The Gulf countries need to be respected by Israel, and that's very essential. So there's a lot of work that can be done, but now that there's normalization, just like every country in the world, everyone, they can both share ideas and they can work together. And I think that, normalization is a sine qua non, right? It's the most basic thing. The question is how to build on that. And I think every other country in the world basically has relations with each other. So hopefully we'll see it move forward, and hopefully the website I created or whatever, other people will come on board and take that to some other place where it will become a kind of news aggregator or a place that people can share information.
Okay, obviously this piece is very, very different from the old piece with Egypt and Jordan that Israel has. Like Egypt was 1979 and with Jordan 1994. So people aren't traveling back and forth between those countries. So what is different this time with UAE and Bahrain? Can you explain a little bit the dimension of what are people-to-people communications, or is it just diplomatic, or what else is there to these relations that are now normalized?
Well, I think unfortunately one of the problems that we saw in the region was that there was a sense that even though Egypt made the peace treaty and so did Jordan, that these countries didn't actually have to encourage their societies to be more tolerant towards Israel or coexistence towards Jews and things like that. So, and I would lay part of the blame on that in a bit of the West, because I think Western countries also enabled countries in the region to basically be institutionally anti-Semitic and extremist anti-Israel, and didn't say anything about it in a way that the West, I think, in generally would not have tolerated countries in other parts of the world just having visceral hatred for other countries and other faiths, and yet having a peace treaty and then not really doing anything peaceful. So I think that unfortunately there was an idea that these countries, the ruler would sign the peace agreement and then the rest of the cake, as it were, because the ruler is kind of the frosting, the rest of the cake wouldn't change at all. And I think that was a very bad way to make peace. You should not make peace. Imagine if in Europe in 1945, if they'd made peace after the Second World War, and yet all the countries still hated each other, and you had the EU come into being, and yet in France every day they have propaganda against Germany, and Germany's got propaganda against Italy. That would be crazy if people were all teaching each other hatred for each other, and yet here they have the agreement, the Schengen, and all this. How could you have an EU if everyone hates each other? So I think we saw that after the 1918 and the First World War that is what happened. There was an agreement, and everyone still had the animosities and hatred. So that's not how you make peace. And I think we understood that with Egypt and Jordan, there was a peace agreement. It did not go well. In general, I think there's evidence would show that there's very high levels of anti-Semitism in Egypt, more so probably than Iran, by the way, for the average person, unfortunately. And in Jordan, a lot of hostility towards Israel. And of course, the Jordanians would say yes, but that's because the Israelis, they don't leave the West Bank, and they change the status quo in Jerusalem. They violate the Al-Aqsa. But I'm sure that these people have reasons that they're hostile to Israel sometimes. But I just think in the end of the day, the education system in those countries didn't do enough. I think now we're seeing some changes because the Gulf countries are really showing, and I think also Morocco and Sudan, that you can have a peace that is based on coexistence, interfaith, respect, For instance, having media personalities in those countries interview Israelis. When's the last time an Israeli was interviewed on a TV in Jordan or Egypt? When's the last time an ambassador even was able to hold an event? Or when's the last time they even had a Holocaust Memorial Day in those countries? I mean, it's just unfortunate, but that was allowed to happen. And now we're seeing a much different model. And I think that it's the kind of model we expect to see in places like South America, Europe, all over the world, where most countries basically get along with each other and don't have visceral hatred for each other. So, and hopefully we'll see what happens. I mean, I do think the peace in the Gulf will influence Jordan and Egypt in a positive way, because it will allow the leaders there to say, oh, you see, in the Gulf, they're being tolerant. Good. We can do that as well. And so they'll have that will give them, let's say, cover to talk more coexistence instead of being seen as collaborators with Zionism or something strange.
Thanks for elaborating that. So it seems like qualitatively totally different with new perspectives. And you mentioned it already, the Palestinian question. So if I remember it well, the Arab League didn't even schedule an emergency meeting and were denying the Palestinian resolution proposal in the end when they met on a regular meeting. What does that mean, that the PA can no longer dominate over Arab policies towards Israel? Or asked differently, during the negotiations of the Abraham Accords, the Palestinian cause played a role. You mentioned already the annexation issue. What role did it play, and what does that mean for the future of the Palestinian cause or Palestinian-Israel relations, peace possibilities? Please elaborate that a little bit.
I think, unfortunately, the Palestinian cause is another example of a place where there was a kind of taking for granted or acceptability of which the Palestinian national movement and its, let's say, political arms in Ramallah or even Hamas in Gaza would be permitted, under the guise of even having some peace after Oslo, to still celebrate, openly terrorism, to celebrate the murdering of children on buses and bombings. I mean, things that would never be tolerated anywhere else in the world. Where else in the world do you have avenues or squares named after people whose main job was to blow up a bunch of children? I mean, come on. The Palestinians were allowed that because there was this strange idea that somehow, quote unquote, armed struggle, this non-romantic notion of murdering people, was accepted. It should never have been accepted. But unfortunately, I think that we did go to a peace agreement which enabled that, and without asking the Palestinians to change much, that rhetoric. The rhetoric, for instance, that tells children that we're growing up that they will return to Tel Aviv, that Tel Aviv is Palestine. I mean, it's how can you have a peace agreement when in reality you have two sides, especially the Palestinian side, says, well, that country doesn't exist, it's actually Palestine. And when you have also in Israel, I think, a lot of some people that never totally ignored the agreement and said, well, let's just keep building Israeli communities in the West Bank. Well, how can you do that if you're going to have a state there for the Palestinians? So I think it's a peace agreement. It was very problematic. What you ended up with is a conflict that continued a bit. And what you've ended up then in the end is that it is an area, I think the West Bank is one of these many areas in the world that are an unsettled conflict situation. And like whether it's Kashmir or parts of Somalia or other places in the world that are not exactly clear, there is what basically we should say is an autonomous Palestinian region that is a kind of part of Israel. And that there is another area in Gaza Strip, which is its own little mini state. And, it's not that these kind of areas don't exist any other places. What is happening in Abkhazia or South Ossetia in the Caucasus? Those are states that are kind of mini states that are technically part of Georgia, but are run by Russia or something. I mean, there's a lot of little areas like that in the world that are intractable, problematic conflicts. The same thing happens between Azerbaijan and Armenia, unfortunately. And these conflicts are just not solved. And I think it looks like they will continue. It may not be solvable. That may also be because I think the Western paradigm after the colonial period in the Cold War was everything can be solved by drawing a little line on a map. And sometimes we're living under the legacy of that era, similar to Kashmir. And maybe the problem is we just need to think outside the box and think about, okay, how can we have this function still as an autonomous region and yet also have Israel and also have Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to have to be a way to come to that conclusion. It may be that, we don't have exactly a peace agreement, but we don't have conflict either. And I think hopefully that will happen. I do think in general, the region now understands the Palestinian issue, is an important issue, but it's not the most important. And it can be viewed as a conflict area similar to many other areas. By the way, Eastern Ukraine, you have 2 breakaway republics. I don't know if that will be solved. Maybe it's not solvable. So I think that's what may happen.
Don't you think that also can give a boost to the conflict solving between Israelis and Palestinians? Because if I have to resume US and European policy toward the conflict, it was like you have to get pressure on Israel, then you get a solution. And perhaps this time is different around. The Palestinians do know they don't have any pressure anymore on other Arab states on normalizing with Israel. So they have to rethink their point. So don't you think that might be a possibility that the Palestinian leadership might be under that pressure that they will do concess or do more concessions when it comes to negotiating with Israel?
I mean, not this Palestinian leadership. They'll never give any concessions. This leadership is old. It's it's like the kind of communist leadership of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, before Gorbachev, the guys like Andropov and these guys. I mean, Brezhnev, it's an old group. They're clinging to the past. I mean, Abbas was born in 1937, I think. I mean, they have to live with their past. They cannot betray it because they will feel they are betraying it by giving up on the dream of statehood. So, and Hamas, of course, also, is intransient. I don't think we'll see that until we see a new generation come to power. And the question is whether the new generation, will be able to tell their own people, listen, I don't know how we're going to get the state. What's the compromise? I think there's another problem, which is in Israel also. Israel is a bit drunk on power. Israel feels that at least the right wing doesn't feel it has to make any concessions. I see this a lot in the discussions in Israel. They say, oh, well, you see, we've got the Gulf now. We don't have to deal with the Palestinians. Well, that's not really a fair way to look at it. Palestinians, there's millions of people. They should have some rights. They need to be able to travel. There needs to be some hope for them. So I think Israel, unfortunately, the far right or right also is totally dismissive and very arrogant because they really think they've totally won. And I think that that's not a good way to approach policy either. So there's problems on both ends.
Thank you for this balanced answer. Now we have to talk a little bit about it. We sure have to talk about Iran and the threat to the region that is going out from the Iranian regime. It is obvious that one cause for the reconciliation of the Arab Emirates and Israel is Iran. It's not the only one. We talked a lot about economy and technology and other reasons. So, but it is not the. How do the UAE and Israel see the Iranian threat? Is there a common view, a shared view between both of them? And how far do they think strategic cooperation can go between Israel and the Emirates? So what is possible in this security cooperation with the Iranian threat between Israel and the Arab Emirates?
My sense is actually the UAE and Bahrain do not want to provoke any sort of tensions with Iran too much because they have a lot to lose. They're very close to Iran. I think they do not, they don't mind, of course, that Israel, maybe there will be some security or intelligence sharing, but I don't think that they want a conflict. So they're very worried that I think that could overflow. I think the Saudis are the ones actually that are much more willing to be openly say, listen, we're really going to be tough on Iran. We want America to be tough on Iran. We hope the Israelis, we kind of quietly support them or whatever in terms of what they're doing. The Saudis are the ones that are more concerned about what Iran is because Iran has actually physically attacked Saudi Arabia in Abqaiq with the drone strikes in 2019 in September, and also using the Houthis to send hundreds of attacks in Saudi Arabia. So it's a real proxy war. And I think Saudi Arabia is very concerned, but I think the Gulf is a much more difficult situation. The Gulf is very wealthy countries, very small population, large numbers of expats. They cannot tolerate any Iranian aggression, and Iran knows that. So they're treading very carefully. They don't want to be involved in the midst of a conflict. I believe, actually, that the UAE's partnership with Israel is more complicated. I think it's not just about Iran. It's about the fears of the Brotherhood and Islamist extremism across the region, and a sincere belief in embracing moderation and security consensus that is about stability in the region. Stability means not just Iran, it means also stabilizing other places, making sure that Iraq doesn't fall apart, making sure that Turkey doesn't start more trouble in places like Libya and places like that. So I think the concept is stability, and I think they want stability and they want to have economic success. So that insofar as Iran is involved, that means they want stability in Yemen. But the UAE, by the way, has drawn down its role in Yemen. And I think that's an example of how the UAE is actually trying to reduce any tensions with Iran. And Israel, therefore, must pay attention to that, because the idea that Israel would ever involve itself in tensions in the Persian Gulf close to the UAE, I think would actually be a problem for the UAE. I think there's a preference, therefore, that the Israel-Iran tensions remain with Hezbollah in Lebanon and with the problems in Syria, with the Iranian regime kind of entrenching. And I think the preference is to keep it over there, not have it spill over in the Gulf, which has enough problems, I think.
Let's continue a bit about Saudi Arabia, because you mentioned it. They have a more regional interest in working together with Israel vis-a-vis the Iranian threat. So is it possible that they would come on board soon with the Abraham Accords and also make normalization with Israel? Is that in the cards?
I don't think it's in the cards unless something changes, unless Israel doesn't even have a government now. There's another elections, endless elections. I mean, Israel has to have a strong government that Saudi Arabia can rely on. Israel would have to make some, at least pretend to make some concession, I guess, to work with the Saudis, at least show the Saudis something has changed. I think that, the Saudis also, if they're put in a corner by the Biden administration through some sort of American cutoff of weapons or sanctions or something weird, that could perhaps, you never know, that could push them closer to Israel further away, but it could create a situation that might have unforeseen consequences, such as a sudden peace agreement or something strange. Well, I don't know. I think the Saudis have to tread carefully. I think the king is not seen to be as close to Israel as the crown prince, and of course the crown prince himself faces all these controversies in the West. I mean, so Saudi Arabia just has so many issues that they're dealing with. They're trying to deal with the fallout of the Qatar crisis or the Gulf crisis. They're trying to deal with the fact that Turkey is trying to usurp Saudi Arabia's role in the Islamic world. And I think Saudi Arabia has to wonder about what's going on there. I mean, Saudi Arabia has lost its influence a bit in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. It wants to try to claw that back. And look at the recent controversy now in Jordan with the questions about the kingdom and some half brother or something of the king. So, those monarchies all have to be wary of any instability. And I think, therefore, Israel's important, but instability in the monarchies is more important. And they may not want to gamble on not yet another peace agreement until seeing what this one has achieved for them.
But certainly the Abraham Accords wouldn't have been possible without the consent of the Saudi Arabia. So if you want to give us an estimation of what you think, this is a cooperation for stability, you said, for the United Arab Emirates and for Israel. How much more is possible when you look in the future a little bit? So people say here we have to find a regional security system that is like the OECD. OECD, like in Europe, a security system in the Middle East, countries working together and develop more and more friendly relationships and a security net and a network where peace can be based on. So give us a vision for the next 5 years, the next decade. How can this develop with the normalization treaties and more partners being on board?
Well, I think first we have to see that the pandemic reduces a bit so that we can have more flights. And then the question is going to be, okay, who is going to be allowed into Israel from the UAE? Just Emirati citizens or all the expats? And how will that become a new flight corridor? We could see hundreds of thousands of people transiting the new corridor. That could mean that, Israel was usually what is a kind of airline cul-de-sac, which meant that flights came to Israel and never went anywhere else. They just went back. Like, no one ever said that, you know what I'm going to do this weekend? I'm going to fly to Israel, and then from there I will go to the UAE, and then I will go to India. It's like, no. You go to Israel, you go back. You go to Israel, you go back. That's why most of the people coming to Israel are either pilgrims or they're Jewish. It's not seen as like this cool jet set, like I go to Israel and hang out 1 week, and then the next week I spend in the UAE. But you know what? Now that's possible. And all of a sudden you have a lot of options. I can go spend a few days at the holy sites in Jerusalem. I can be on the beach in the amazing 5-star hotel in Dubai and having fun in the Dubai Mall, after that, and skiing or whatever. So I just think that's where we can start to see a new flight corridor, potentially new economic corridor, with trade going through Eilat to Ashdod or something like that. Who knows? Could be gas or freight or other things. By the way, diamonds, a lot of interesting industries will become part of this. Diamonds are a big one in Dubai and Tel Aviv. People sometimes don't know that, but big market. Also, we can talk about, I guess, natural gas, coffee, all sorts of things. So it's really a lot of things. Food technology, financial technology. There's a lot of things that Israel and the UAE pioneer in the world, and there are sorts of really pioneering cool technologies. I think seeing the tech hubs and the hundreds of millions or billions of investment that can pour into startups. They say that Israel is kind of the startup nation or whatever, and that UAE can be the scale-up nation, taking the Israeli ideas and allowing them to kind of go global with a country that really has a lot of expats in it. And a lot of those expats in the UAE are people that are not hostile to Israel. They're people from Europe or people from the US or India. They're interested in Israeli technology. They admire Israel. They want to be like Israel, some of them. So there's a lot that can happen there. In terms of the technology exchange, defense tech, I think, Israel will tread carefully because Israel has a lot of agreements with the US, but of course the US wants the UAE as a partner as well. So there can be some defense technology. I think there already has been a lot that was done, let's say, quietly or with third parties. Now the question is, what about larger platforms and things? Is it conceivable we will see Israeli, publicly see Israeli radar systems or even air defense systems in the Gulf? I mean, that's certainly a possibility, but there's a lot of hoops and jumps. So we'd have to see, how that works. Israeli defense companies all ran over to UAE this year for IDEX, which was a huge defense confab. So Israelis are super excited about shopping Israel is one of the leading defense countries producing defense technology in the world. I mean, Israel's 3 big defense giants are really some of the biggest defense contractors in the world. So there's a lot that can be done. I think we'll start to see, people-to-people visits, high-profile meetings, because so far, by the way, we haven't really seen a meeting of the leaders of these countries. We haven't seen any joint military exercises, which could happen with the CENTCOM, like America as a broker, or we could see a naval exercise in the next year or two. That's certainly a possibility because now, the peace agreements have kind of koshered that. For the first time ever, we might see, publicly, the planes practicing together. So that would be a big deal because in the past there were rumors, but the question is, wait, a UAE, F-16 landing in Israel, or not, maybe not that, maybe both of them practicing in Greece because it's kind of koshered by a third country. Greece hosting a regional exercise. That would be a big symbolic deal. And I think that would be the next. So, but these things everything moves slowly in the region. The UAE is a country that's, very thoughtful, very pragmatic. And as you noted, I think we discussed Saudi Arabia, of course, is in on that. So they're giving the green light to those types of things, or at least talking about yes, no. So I think that's the big question mark is when we see that. And I think, Israel may want to move quickly because Israel is a kind of country that is a bit like, it's a country that thinks and acts quickly. It's very flexible. UAE, I think, it's a monarchy. It's more conservative. It's cautious, as it should be. So that's where we'll see what happens in the next 5-10 years, I think.
What about sharing intelligence together between UAE and Israel? You said that the pact is about stability for both sides. So is there already shared information, or is it possible in the future?
Well, I mean, I think that's the kind of thing we'll never know, right? I mean, it's like you never know about intelligence sharing. I mean, of course, we know there are networks like the Five Eyes or whatever, and we know, of course, that Israel has good relations with the U.S. But I think we never know about the degree of what, maybe that's gone on for years. I mean, so we just don't. I think we don't know, and we'll never know, and that's probably good, because if we knew about it, then that wouldn't be intelligence sharing. What's the quote they say? Those who know don't speak, and those who speak don't know. So, I think that's the answer. We'll
think about it, because you said the common enemy is Islamist extremism. So and both share an interest to combat that. So
well, look, I think in terms of real threats, I mean, it would behoove all these countries, I assume them, that they will all be looking at big threat developments. I know for a fact it seems like the attack on Saudi Arabia in September 2019 with drones and cruise missiles was, I think, one person I interviewed in Israel said that's like a Pearl Harbor. It's a huge game changer. We really need to wake up. And by the way, what did Israel say in the last few months about Iron Dome when they openly announced new capabilities for Iron Dome and the missile defense in Israel? They said it can confront drone and cruise missile threats. So, I mean, here you have a drone and cruise missile threat in September 2019 against Saudi Arabia. All of a sudden, 2 years later, or a year and a half later, Israel says, yeah, our defense systems can protect against that. So I think you just have to, it's just obvious. I mean, here you have a threat, and Israel's going to respond to that threat, because the kind of Iranian threats against one country are certainly the same technology is used against Israel. And it may be that what Iran is doing with the Houthis is a dry run for an attack on Israel from Hezbollah or from Syria. So I think it's totally understandable that these conflicts are seen now as interlinked, and therefore I would have, it would be, you would think it would behoove these countries to discuss, some levels of like, okay, what's coming next? What do we know about Iranian drone technology, new Iranian ballistic missiles, et cetera, et cetera?
You were bringing the issue again to Iran. So I want to know a little bit about you. You said they're all interconnected, those conflicts, with the Houthis in Yemen, with Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, Hezbollah itself in Lebanon and in Syria. So at what kind of threat do you see in Iran for all the conflicts in the regions going on at the moment?
Iran is a country that I think, punches above its weight in terms of what it does. It has an economy that is in shambles, but it's nevertheless has very smart and good technology. So it's building a lot of ballistic missiles and drones and interesting weapon systems in that respect. But, drones and ballistic missiles don't win wars. Have you ever read about a war that was won by missiles? I haven't read. There's no such thing as that. Never happened in history. You can't win a war just by firing missiles. You can harass an enemy. So, Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles. They say that if there's a war, we'll be seeing 1,000 of them a day fired at Israel. Is that accurate? Is that true? I mean, how can they fire 1,000 a day? They have enough launchers. They'd have to roll out a lot of launchers to do that. Can they do that while being attacked by Israeli airplanes? And it's a good question. I think that means what we're seeing from Iran is a lot of threats. Iran uses asymmetric threats, which means like, it doesn't try to fight you man to man. It doesn't say tank to tank or plane to plane. It says, okay, you have tanks and planes and all blah, 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 and we have a few missiles. Okay, so they can fire missiles, but so what are they going to hit? Iran will try to strike at what? Big population centers maybe, but they don't want a big death toll because, has Iran ever carpet bombed a city and killed lots of random people? They don't like this. Iran doesn't like to perceive itself as doing that. So, will they strike at Israeli, other like sensitive installations? I think there's a fear of that. So Israel has produced some of the best air defense in the world to, I think, contradict that. And I think that, therefore, with Iran, I think we see a country that talks a lot, but when it comes to actually doing things, what does Iran really do? It arms all of its proxy militias, which are kind of a combination of terror armies, mafias, gangs. They're very bad. But Iran uses them to kind of eat up the region. It's kind of like it's like the way rust eats up a car or eats up metal. Iran kind of slowly digests parts of the region with all these militias, and wherever Iran goes with its militias, the country's become poor and economically ruined. I mean, look at Iraq, look at Lebanon, look at Yemen. I mean, everywhere Iran is, you've got an economic disaster, countries that infrastructure barely works. So what's the Iranian thing? They eat up the country, they send the militias in, they hijack and destroy part of it. They get all the Shiites they hijack the religious establishment of the Shiites, and then they put anti-Israel propaganda in people's mouths, anti-American propaganda, and then they use them as a proxy to attack someone else, so that when the other person responds, they have to fight the militia and not Iran. Because Iran's main goal is that you'll never fight Iran, because Iran itself, as the regime is anyway weak and doesn't want to fight a war. It wants Israel or America to fight in Lebanon, to fight in Iraq, to fight in Syria, to fight in Yemen, and destroy all of those countries. And then while the regime in Iran sits around. So I think that's what Iran is doing. It's not great, but Iran's nuclear program is an existential threat to Israel. That's 100% true. But outside the nuclear program, a militia like Hezbollah is not going to conquer Israel. I mean, it's going to be totally destroyed if there's a war. Of course, it will cause pain and suffering. But these things like Houthis. I mean, yes, the Houthis can attack Israel with drones, and they can send drones to attack Eilat and make a lot of tourists scared. But what else can they do? I mean, they're not going to swim to Israel. They don't have a navy. So, I mean, that's the thing about Iran. I think it's a dangerous, it hijacks countries and turns them into bases for terrorism. But terrorists don't really win wars. Terrorists don't take over countries. They just spread death and killing, and you have to find ways to defend against them or neutralize them.
But isn't it in the interest of the Iranian regime to spread chaos, to, in this chaos, in the few years, develop their nuclear capabilities and follow their ultimate plan to destroy Israel in the end? Yeah, with that. So
that's what they say. But I mean, the real question we have to ask ourselves is, aren't there other restraining factors in Iran? I mean, China and Turkey and Russia don't want them to develop a real nuclear bomb either. So I mean, Iran is a tremendous threat. It's a very sophisticated threat. It should not be underestimated, and it should stop its behavior. But Iran is, I think, probably scared of a real conventional conflict with Israel, and it knows that Israel knows how to retaliate. So it should probably think twice about what it's doing.
Okay, thanks. Let's talk a little bit about the nuclear program and the JCPOA, the nuclear treaty between Iran and the other countries, America, free European countries, and Russia and China. So is it a danger with the US administration now returning quickly to the JCPOA, the nuclear accord with Iran, or from looking from Israel, like your perspective? So are you worried in Israel that the America and the new administration will go quickly back to the old treaty with Iran, or what do you expect? Is there more room for maneuver, or don't we see a coming back of the JCPOA? So please tell me your thoughts.
I think it's concerning, the voices that want to appease Iran, or that allow Iran to dictate the narrative and allow Iran to use nuclear enrichment as a way to leverage things. It's very bad to have a regime that is always this kind of boogeyman saying, well, if you don't give us something, we'll enrich uranium. I mean, no other regime behaves that way. Iran is a kind of criminal regime. But I think, Israel's not as concerned the same way it was in the past, because I think there is evidence the Biden administration is listening to Israel, and Israel has also increased its abilities and capabilities in the last decade. So, I think the question is, will the Biden administration, will they cave and start to reduce the sanctions? And the big question with those sanctions is also, how effective are they? I think there is a lot of evidence. The sanctions prevented Iran sending a lot of money and material to its proxies like Hezbollah. So I think the big concern is, if you reduce the sanctions, it's not really the nuclear program just as the major issue. It's the way in which these other areas benefit from Iran, and that means that Iran is stronger in Iraq and stronger in Syria, and that's not good. I think in terms of the nuclear program, there is a certain red line for Israel somewhere in terms of enrichment, because you don't want to have too much enriched uranium at the point at which Iran could then begin to, use it for a device. So I think it's important that the Biden administration take into account the fact that, Israel has serious red lines. Israel, does not want Iran to go beyond them. And, Iran is, of course, openly saying it's spinning all these advanced centrifuges and enriching the uranium. And so you have to wonder, where does what's Iran thinking? Will it really try to go for the bomb, or will it just, I think Iran, tries to use this in the negotiations, so we'll see what happens.
Okay, thank you so far, but I'm gonna bring in some questions from the audience. We have some questions already, and the question I'm gonna ask you is related to the US issue. Andrea Bienel is asking, how do you judge the sustainability of the Israeli-Arab Accords? In the case the EU, the European Union, and the current Biden administration won't fully support normalization due to other priorities, Iran deal or the Palestinian issues or China, or what is the sustainability? Is there a chance that this could fail again?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, look, once countries normalize relations, I don't think historically there are many examples of them totally ending the relations. I mean, look at Turkey. Turkey's current regime leader hates Israel. In fact, I would say that he hates Israel as much as Iran does. So, yet the countries have relations. So, the normal affair in the world for almost all countries is to have relations, even if they hate each other. So, it's only in Israel's case was there this bizarre theory that, like, well, let's just have countries not have relations with Israel because that will get Israel to do something. Well, Israel doesn't do anything. I don't know. It didn't work. So, I don't think that it's not going to go back. I think the big question is whether or not the Western countries will continue to support more normalization. And it's strange if they don't, because, Western democracies talk about how everyone needs to engage and we should have peace. So oddly enough, Western countries seem to have made all sorts of compromises and engagement and all this, even with countries that are quite anti-Western, they try to engage with them. So I would think they would want Israel and the Arab states and the remaining ones to have some very low level engagement.
There's another question related to the US from the audience. Some say that the Abraham Accords were signed in particular because the US promised advanced weapons to the Arab states. So can you comment on that a little bit? That is only because the US promised weapons or planes, fighter planes.
I mean, that would strike me as a bit a bad reading of that. I mean, I think the idea that if I give you 5 planes, you're going to create a peace deal that will last forever with another country is a bit strange. What then? If you get rid of the peace deal and I take the planes back, I don't think it makes any sense. Planes are just a machine. Machines don't live forever, so peace deals do live forever. So I think it's a misreading of it. I think that whatever there may have been corollaries of, okay, please make peace with Israel, and by the way, we understand that you'd like to have these advanced F-35s, and wouldn't it be great if after the peace deal that were to happen also? I mean, the Trump administration was very transactional because Trump believed that foreign relations were like an episode of The Apprentice a bit, that you just make a deal. And you know what? By the way, Trump wasn't always wrong. Sometimes foreign relations, oddly enough, do operate that way. It doesn't operate in the simplistic way of I give you 5 potatoes and now we have relations. No, it's that's part of the overall milieu of the deal. And I think it's entirely plausible that the idea that, yes, the UAE has wanted advanced American drones and F-35s for many years, and now it might be easier, like the deal could pave the way for that. As we can see, anyone understood that if Trump lost, that could be off the table. So I can't believe the UAE would gamble on that and say, well, we're going to gamble on Trump's victory. Anybody who's smart would understand that you can't gamble on that. So therefore, it doesn't strike me as logical. It strikes me as it was something that was there in the room, and that was, yes, great, we'll try to do that also. So
this would give it more and more sustainability in your view. I'd like to turn to another issue where a question from the audience is about, like, an issue which is very important to us. I think you said in your introductory part about the first event in the UAE about the Holocaust, where Arab experts are talking on a panel about their experience at Yad Vashem. Yes, this is taking place tomorrow or today. I don't know exactly. And I see more and more visibility of the Jewish community also in the Arab Emirates. The question is about Shoah education in the curriculum of the United Arab Emirates. What role does it mean that, as somebody heard, the curricula are changed to more Holocaust education in the UAE? So what role does it, how important is that? What role does it play?
I think it's very important. I mean, again, we took it for granted for many years that countries in the region, because they didn't like Israel, would somehow like not educate about the Holocaust. Doesn't that sound kind of anti-Semitic? Like, oh, we'll deny the Holocaust because we don't like Israel, which doesn't make any sense at all. So, I mean, under what other circumstances would you deny that? Let's deny the genocide of Native Americans to get back at America. That makes no sense. So it never made sense. It's unfortunate the region was so poisoned by anti-Semitism, by the way, not anti-Israelism, anti-Semitism, that it allowed itself, that we ever allowed this to happen. I mean, I don't know why Western diplomats weren't always having Holocaust Memorial Day ceremonies in the region openly to educate the public and say, yeah, we're going to show that, yes, the Holocaust happened. So, you know, it's great. The UAE has made a great step in this direction. It should have happened many years ago throughout the region. It's unfortunate it didn't. But now it's a big step. And I think it will be a message for the region that, yes, you can acknowledge the Holocaust, which should be obvious. I mean, there's no controversy. Why was that ever controversial? I mean, it's one thing that they say, you know, relations between Armenia and Turkey, that there would be, okay, Turkey doesn't want to talk about the Armenian genocide. Okay, fine. But what would it have to do with other countries? So I think it's very strange. It's great to see it. And, you know, it warms our hearts to see the interfaith and coexistence stuff. But it also makes us wonder, I think, wait, shouldn't that have happened years ago? Why was the Middle East the one part of the world where intolerance was considered totally normal? And no one ever said, well, no, that's not normal. The rest of the world is having tolerance and different religions and Holocaust Memorial Days. It should happen here, obviously. And I think, okay, so we're finally breaking that dam or whatever. And hopefully now we'll start to see everyone relaxing, because it was, unfortunately, for so long, the idea was, if you recognize the Holocaust, you're like a Zionist or something. It's like, wait, but why was that ever connected? I mean, it should never have been connected. And I think that, it's also like the Jewish thing. It's like, yes, there can be Hanukkah and you can say happy, you know, Rosh Hashanah. I mean, it's okay. It doesn't have to be connected to Israel. And now we're seeing leaders in the region feel openly expressing that without the strange idea that masses of people would then protest it as some sort of pro-Israel conspiracy.
Thank you. Another question reflects the broader issue of Islamism in the region. If there is Arab states, religious authorities in the UAE, which do recognize Israel, do recognize the Holocaust, do recognize Jew hatred is a problem in the region. There is this fight between two factions, the Islamists, the extremists, and secular, not secular, excuse me, moderate Muslims in the region. So there's a fight going on in the whole region. So is there a shift thinkable that in this fight, the moderate parts could have the upper hand?
Yeah, I think, look, the Middle East is a region that unfortunately in the 1970s and 80s produced a lot of homegrown extremism because of extremist teachings and the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda and all these things that grew out of it. You know, like, look, that was a very bad period. It's a bit the way, you know, fascism and Nazism suddenly took root very quickly, by the way, in the 20s and 30s. I mean, we're talking, how quickly did it take fascism and Nazism to suddenly grab hold of countries? It only took 13 years. So I think we can say that Islamism and extremism grabbed hold of large parts of society in the Middle East. And this society in the Middle East exported it. Where Al-Qaeda came from here, went to Afghanistan. And what's fascinating now, after years of war, we have seen, I think, a lot of young people, a new generation, who have no interest in blowing up churches or massacring or genociding people, By the way, when ISIS was rising, very few people in the region actually joined ISIS. There were actually in Mosul, a city of like 1 million people, only like a few thousand or 10,000 volunteers, which is like nothing. But there were 50,000 people from all over the world, including 6,000 from Europe, who joined ISIS and came to the region to colonize it. I think that's a symbolic turning point. The region was no longer exporting extremism. It was all the extremists from around the world running into the Middle East. And I think we saw that. And I think that means that the next threat from radical Islamist extremism is not from the Middle East. It's actually, sadly enough, from Europe, from Far East Asia areas, all sorts of other weird places, even maybe in South America, who knows, converts and crazy people. But I think that the Middle East feels that there's been too much war and conflict, and a lot of people are sick and tired, it seems like, of this religious-based extremism. And we see that tiredness, whether it's, not just more tolerance for Israel, but just the way in which people are focusing on other issues today, economic issues, protests in Iraq against Iran, things like that. They're sick of the theocratic extremism, the way the West became sick of, fascism and eventually became sick of militant communism, because people get tired of these things after a few generations, I think, hopefully.
Thank you very much for this answer. I'll get a new question here. Very, very interesting also. So how important is for Israel that the neighboring states become more and more democratic society or respecting human rights more and more? Can the Abraham Accords be a lead step in this direction, or what do you think about that?
I think it's very important in the region that human rights is respected. And I do think many countries know that they are certainly being watched. That being said, we have seen, for instance, in Turkey, vicious crackdowns on any dissent against gay rights activists, against anyone who's a critic. We have seen, of course, crackdowns as well in the Gulf or North Africa and places. But we also see a lot of hope in terms of places that people are fighting for their freedoms and protesting, whether it's in Iraq or Eastern Syria or even Algeria or other places. It's difficult. I don't think the Abraham Accords, unfortunately, really go hand in hand with promoting democracy or human rights. I'm not saying that I would not say that they're against democracy and human rights, because some people have argued that, well, it's an authoritarian agreement. I don't think that's a fair thing. It's a normalization agreement. I don't think that it's true that, yes, the UAE is trying to open up, and they have they have media, and they have limited types of speech, of course, and they have coexistence, etc. But most of the Gulf states are monarchies, and there are certain red lines about what you can critique. So I think we understand that I don't think we're going to see a trend towards too much democratization, because I think there was a sense that democratization was hijacked by extremists in the 90s and early 2000s, and that's, for instance, in Turkey. I mean, it was a democracy. The AKP party used the claims of democracy to now hijack and destroy the country and take over all of the free media. So that's not great. Nobody wants to see that happen. So unfortunately, the region is a bit afraid of too much democratization. That being said, in terms of the human rights thing, I think the region is trying to be better today than, 20, 30 years ago. It wasn't so long ago. Saddam Hussein was openly gassing the Kurdish people. No one's doing that today, by the way. Turkey, of course, has been quite brutal towards Kurds in Afrin in Syria, but gassing people is not happening. There are targeted drone strikes and things, but I don't know. I think that everyone is more careful today, because they know that there's a lot more eyes out there, a lot more satellites watching. People are able to keep track of things, and so that's a positive. And the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, making human rights a bedrock, which I think America should do, is important. It's important to do that. But I would say democratization, I'd say it not because of the Abraham Accords. The global trend is authoritarianism, regardless of the Abraham Accords.
Okay, then there is a question about the corona pandemic. So can you explain a little bit the impact on the Middle East, or on Israel, or on the United Arab Emirates? Please tell us a little about the current situation with the pandemic in the Middle Eastern countries.
Well, Israel is one of the leading leaders in the world in terms of vaccination. Now everything in Israel is opened again, which is good after very harsh lockdowns, chaos, very bad, I think, very difficult time in Israel, much worse than some other places. Even though the number of deaths, is not huge, but it's thousands. It was difficult for Israel. Israel was a small country. Israel was efficient in terms of fighting the COVID. It used its technology, it used its army, it used everything at its disposal. The UAE, as I understand it, had also a very tough lockdown in the beginning, and then tried to open up in the fall. And then a lot of people came in with variants, and cases went crazy. And then they tried to vaccinate everyone, and now they're trying to get back to normal again. And hopefully, we'll have a travel bubble now with the UAE and Israel, so that'd be great. There is joint cooperation between Group 42 and IEI and Rafael on fighting the COVID issue, and we're going to see more of that. Group 42, I think, is also working with China on some issues, vaccines and stuff. So we're going to see, I think, an interesting triangulation there. Of course, that America's
Group 42 is a United Arab Emirates firm, yeah?
Is a UAE firm, and of course, I'm sure the US will be a bit reticent about the China stuff. But look, I do think there's a lot to be done there, and hopefully, fighting the COVID can be. I think it was a way for the Israel and the UAE to grow closer in June of last year, and it will continue to be a way. I do hope that the countries can use these are wealthy countries, so we should be able to be an example of the world, and we need to do better. So I hope we'll see what happens in the next few months if these small countries in the region can be an example to the world and to the region. Hopefully that happens.
How far is vaccination in the UAE? Do you know?
I haven't looked at the latest numbers, but I did understand that they were one of the world leaders alongside Israel and the UK and the US. And several other places. So that was what we heard. I mean, and of course, I guess hopefully we'll see if that should have an effect. But the problem with the UAE is that it's a big hub for expats. So you can vaccinate everyone, and then 3 weeks later, as I said, 100,000 people come running in. So then what do you have? Maybe they should vaccinate them at the airport. That, by the way, is what they should do. They should just vaccinate people as they come in. But we'll see if someone thinks of that.
So as I understand, cooperation is going on between Israel and the UAE, also on the vaccination part. What else do you want to stress as cooperation possibilities? What will we see? What do we see already, or do we see developed?
I think there's a real possibility here to develop some really interesting technology in terms of food technology, desalination, use of the desert, the way Israel's founding fathers envisioned the desert blooming, and also learning from the UAE about how to build buildings and stuff and how to build better 5-star hotels. And Israel needs a lot of help in hospitality and hosting and learning how to do that, because Israel traditionally is a country that is actually not very good at dealing with tourists, and actually can be kind of a rough ride, to be honest, because it's a country that's a bit rude. Israel could learn a lot from the UAE in terms of how to do things right and make things that actually look nice and actually work, and not have like fixtures that fall out of the wall. And on the other side of the coin, they could learn a lot from Israel in terms of, how to make, I think, better food, food security. And maybe there could be a way to partner in that and really, do what the UAE is great at taking absolutely nothing and building a city in like a week. I think it'd be great if Israel could learn from that and actually turn the Negev, make it a real hub of people. Everyone currently is stuck in Tel Aviv in Israel. It's kind of, no one really lives in the Negev. And I think Israel could do a much better job of moving 1 million people to the Negev in the next 10 years, because the Negev needs people and Tel Aviv is ridiculously crowded. So we could learn from the UAE. The UAE knows how to do that. It looks a lot like the Negev. So we'll see. The question is, if Israel needs to liberalize its economy, the UAE has done a lot on liberalization of the economy, especially Dubai. Not all of the UAE, but Dubai has. Israel is still locked in a almost, Soviet socialist old way of doing business. And Israel needs to get to the next stage, at least maybe make part of the country a free zone or something, and let it go. Let that part go wild and develop indigenously with the UAE, and keep it away from the way in which Israel has been sometimes a bit mismanaged. So I think if that happens, it'd be great. If it doesn't happen, then it's just what we're used to.
That sounds really great, and we hope a lot of things will develop like this. Making the desert bloom is always a good project, I think. So last question, and I ask you to summarize a little bit of why do you think it's so historic that these new normalizations treaty did come along last year, and why is it so enormously important and historic?
Well, I think we were stuck at a 25-year pattern since the Oslo Accords, which is itself a historic agreement, but we saw a quarter century of not much progress on peace, and most of the region was kind of falling apart in that time period with ISIS and Iran's strategies. And I think we now see perhaps the opening of a new 25-year chapter, because the region does go by 25 years. It's very interesting. The British conquered Palestine from the Ottomans in 1918 or so. And then you had the Mandate Agreement, and 20 years later or so, you've all of a sudden got the independence of Israel in 48. So you've got this kind of several decades, right? And then from 48 to 67, right? You've got, another few decades, and then you've got the 67 war, which is this huge turning point. And then from 67, up until the peace agreements in the 80s and the Oslo Accords, you've got another, quarter century or so. So the region goes, I think in some ways there is a pattern of these quarter century changes, and they are tectonic. So we could say that this is a tectonic change, and we will set the region on a whole new path, and we'll see. I don't know, but I think you look at those other dates, 1918, 1948, 67, whatever you say, 79 or so, 94, and then 2020, 21, we could be seeing a new regional world order, and that will be very interesting if that happens.
Thank you so much for letting us share your expertise, Mr. Seth Frantzman. Thank you so much. I hope we see us again soon in Israel when I'm able to fly there again. I hope to see you in Jerusalem. Thank you for today. Thank you for your insights and for this vast knowledge you presented. And I hope everybody will return to your website, israelgulfreport.com. The latest news on the historic developments you'll find there, I assure you. Thanks to all in the audience. Thank you for your questions. I hope it was worthwhile listening. I'm sure it was. And I hope I see you for our next event in this series called Israel and the New Middle East by the Mideast Freedom Forum. Thank you again, Mr. Seth Frantzman. Hope to see you soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.